Have you ever heard a guitar riff so distinctive that it could launch an entire band to stardom, and then, years later, ignite one of the wildest sampling controversies in music history? That's exactly what happened when Van Halen's iconic track introduced a new audience to rock riffs through a hip-hop banger. But this wasn't just a friendly crossover. It led to hidden licensing deals, legal disputes, and even a near physical confrontation between guitar legend Eddie Van Halen and a rap artist. In today's video, we're diving deep into the story behind Van Halen's rise from backyard parties to world stages, and how one of their lesser-charting songs became a cornerstone for an unexpected hip-hop classic. Van Halen might seem like they appeared out of thin air in the late 1970s, but their roots stretch back much further. Brothers Eddie and Alex were making noise long before they hit the Sunset Strip. As far back as the mid-1960s, they were performing at school functions in a little band called Broken Combs, showcasing a raw energy that would one day explode onto the rock scene. Even at such a young age, Eddie often found himself stepping up to the mic, determined to front his own group. That wasn't the only name they played under either. Trojan Rubber Company might sound like a gag, but it was just one of the many short-lived names the Van Halen brothers tried. They bounced around as Genesis for a while, only to find out that a British band had already claimed that title. Eventually, they landed on Mammoth, until, once again, they discovered another band was using it. Finally, they settled on the simplest, boldest option of all, Van Halen. Their new moniker didn't instantly open doors. In fact, David Lee Roth, who would later become one of rock's most flamboyant frontmen, kept auditioning for the group and getting rejected. He didn't fit their vision at first. His big break came partly because he owned a public address system, an actual necessity if they wanted to play bigger gigs. Whether by luck or sheer stubbornness, Roth's PA system and electric stage presence gave him an undeniable edge, and the Van Halen classic lineup came to life. But the journey was still far from easy. They eked out a living playing backyard parties around Pasadena, hauling gear in battered vans, and hoping each show would bring them one step closer to stardom. It was anything but an overnight success. Through trial, error, and grit, they developed an onstage chemistry that would eventually change rock music. Yet nobody could have predicted how pivotal that chemistry would become, or how it would kick off one of the most memorable rock debuts ever made. In the mid-1970s, Van Halen's high-octane live shows were already drawing attention in the Los Angeles music scene. People whispered about Eddie's blistering guitar solos, Alex's pounding drum beats, and Roth's flamboyant showmanship. Eventually, these whispers reached the ears of Gene Simmons from Kiss. Simmons saw the raw talent and rushed to sign them onto a development deal. Here's the twist. He wanted them to change their name to Daddy Longlegs. Seriously. Just imagine if Van Halen had followed his advice. We might be talking about Daddy Longlegs as one of the most influential rock bands in history. Though they dodged that questionable rebrand, Simmons did help record a nearly 30-song demo tape in 1976. Despite his confidence in the group, Simmons' connections alone weren't enough to secure them a major label contract. His own management shrugged off Van Halen, insisting the band had zero chance of making it big. In hindsight, that might be one of the most inaccurate predictions in rock music. Enter Doug Messenger, who had worked as Van Morrison's band leader. Messenger was so impressed by Van Halen's Starwood shows in Hollywood that he reached out to Ted Templeman, an A&R man and producer at Warner Brothers Templeman, who was looking for a guitar-driven band to electrify the label's roster. Showed up on a rainy night with Warner Brothers chairman Mo Austin to see for themselves. The venue was nowhere near packed, but the performance was so explosive that Austin reportedly scribbled a letter of intent to sign Van Halen on a bar napkin. One rainy night would set off a sequence of events leading to one of the biggest rock debuts of all time. With the ink not even dry, Van Halen entered the studio. True to their raw style, they recorded nearly 30 tracks in about 2 hours. Templeman and engineer Don Landy realized immediately they had a band that could nail takes live, thanks to years of performing in cramped garages and rowdy backyard parties. Some bands spend months layering each instrument, but Van Halen's approach was refreshingly straightforward. They cranked out the songs in record time, capturing an almost live concert feel on tape. By February 1978, Van Halen's self-titled debut album was ready for the world, featuring a heavier, unpolished edge that stood out from the rising tide of new wave acts. Instead of relying on trendy synthesizers or meticulously overproduced vocals, they stuck to thunderous riffs and raw vocals. The record introduced a revitalized spirit of rock music, loud, fast, and unapologetic. Warner Brothers chose a cover of The Kinks' You Really Got Me as Van Halen's first single, a decision that didn't sit well with Eddie Van Halen. He wasn't opposed to covers in principle. The band had performed them in clubs for years, but he wanted the world to hear his original riffs first. Regardless of Eddie's frustration, the single soared to number 1, 36 on the Billboard Hot 100, effectively catapulting them into the mainstream. One of the Kinks' founding members, Dave Davies, was less than impressed. He took jabs at Eddie's technique, suggesting that it was too perfect and lacked the rawness he felt was essential. The irony? Even Davies couldn't deny the success of Van Halen's version, which many fans came to see as a definitive update of the 1960s classic. Chart performance aside, word spread fast that Van Halen had something special going on. Shows sold out faster than anyone at Warner Brothers could have imagined. For an up-and-coming band, it was a dream scenario. Each single fueled the fire for the next one, culminating in a triumphant homecoming show at the Long Beach Arena, originally booked for just over 5,000 seats. As ticket sales surged, they kept upgrading to larger configurations within the arena, until almost 10,000 fans packed in. Within a mere 2 hours of tickets going on sale, everything was gone. Van Halen had officially entered rock's big leagues. Although overshadowed by hits like You Really Got Me and Running with the Devil, the track Jamie's Crying held its own unique charm. It fused melodic hooks with the band's driving energy, showcasing a different side of Van Halen. Oddly enough, despite its recognition among fans, it never climbed the charts in the US. That lesser chart success might explain why, a decade later, many people who heard its catchy guitar riff for the first time had no idea it was Van Halen at all. The song itself came together in a flash. While the band was in the studio, Templeman overheard Eddie messing around with a simple 2-note pattern that sounded like a distressed wail. Roth caught on and added lyrics about a girl who pulls back from a fleeting romance, a concept that seemed almost ironic given his reputation as an unapologetic ladies' man. Producers and fans alike appreciated the straightforward emotion and pop rock sensibility that set Jamie's Crying apart from the band's more aggressive tracks. Years later, it would find its way into the soundtrack of Howard Stern's movie Private Parts, and it also appeared in the Guitar Hero Van Halen video game. These placements kept the track alive for new generations. But the biggest boost in recognition didn't come from movies or video games. It came from a rap artist named Tone Loc, who would transform Jamie's Crying into something brand new and stir up a hornet's nest in the process. Transition. So how did a rock track that never even charted turn into a hip-hop anthem? The answer lies in a late 80s music scene where rap-rock crossovers were just starting to make waves, sometimes without the band's knowledge or permission. By 1989, rap music was branching into uncharted territory. Tracks like Run DMC's collaboration with Aerosmith on Walk This Way proved that rap-rock fusions could be big business. Meanwhile, the Beastie Boys had smashed boundaries with You Gotta Fight for Your Right. It was the perfect climate for a rapper like Tone Loc, a gravel-voiced artist who wanted to inject rock flavor into his hip-hop sound. Tone Loc teamed up with Matt Dike and Michael Ross, producers who had an ear for hooking rap beats around catchy, often rock-inspired samples. Locke's debut album needed a standout track, and Dike heard potential in Van Halen's Jamie's Crying. His vision? Lift that iconic riff and weave it into a new creation called Wild Thing. Initially, everything seemed above board. The producers approached Van Halen's management, who agreed to a flat fee license, reportedly around $5,000, to use the sample. The catch? Apparently no one told the actual band members. While legal teams worked out the paperwork in the background, Eddie and Alex Van Halen were left blissfully unaware that their own riff was about to feature on a rap track poised to climb the charts. When they finally discovered it, they weren't exactly thrilled. Eddie stumbled upon the music video on MTV, while Alex heard the familiar drum fill on radio one day, leading him to exclaim, "Wait a second, that's my part." When Van Halen learned about Wild Thing, their initial reaction was pure shock, followed swiftly by anger. In the late 80s, sampling was still a legal gray area. There weren't many precedents or established protocols, and lawsuits were starting to pile up. Artists who felt ripped off were bringing cases to court, and judges were scrambling to figure out how to apply copyright laws to a brand new form of musical expression. For the Van Halen brothers, it felt personal. They had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into Jamie's Crying, only to have a chunk of it appear in someone else's song, one that was suddenly all over the radio, music video channels, and dance clubs. Even though Tone Loc's team had actually paid for the sample, the band still felt blindsided, claiming that management had never relayed the arrangement. From their perspective, a measly $5,000 for a riff that propelled a chart-topping single wasn't just unfair, it was insulting. Legal letters flew, and rumors spread about Eddie threatening to physically confront Tone Loc if he ever ran into him face to face. Tone Loc, for his part, claimed that Eddie approached him while tipsy, accusing him of stealing money from Van Halen's pockets. The drama magnified each time Wild Thing climbed another slot on the charts. Eventually, both parties settled out of court for an amount rumored to be somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000. Beyond the payout, the settlement also secured songwriting credits for Eddie and Alex on Wild Thing, ensuring they would receive royalties long after the dust settled. In many ways, this fiasco foreshadowed future sampling controversies. If you didn't dot every I and cross every T, you risked encountering some legendary fury. And for Tone Loc, that fury was Eddie Van Halen in the flesh. Once the lawyers finished hashing out the details, it became clear that the dust-up over Wild Thing had more layers than a simple theft accusation. For Tone Loc, the controversy turned into free publicity. His album, Lock It After Dark, soared, going double platinum with Wild Thing topping out at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The track's memorable hook, built on Van Halen's riff, made it an instant party staple, blasting from car stereos and clubs across the country. Tone Loc always maintained that his producers had tried to do things the right way. In interviews, he insisted that sampling is part of hip-hop culture, linking older songs with fresh beats to create something entirely new. He also pointed out that Van Halen was already huge, and that their cameo in his track might have introduced them to listeners who primarily lived in the rap world. Meanwhile, Van Halen got something out of the deal too, a share of the royalties on a song that would continue to rack up airplay and licensing in commercials, movies, and TV shows. Though Eddie Van Halen remained bitter about how the entire situation was handled, the sample showcased the band's flexibility. Their riff had found new life in a genre they'd never expected to touch. From a broader perspective, Wild Thing stands as an early example of rock-rap fusion that bridged fan bases. It's easy to forget how groundbreaking it was, to blend crunchy guitar riffs with hip-hop grooves. Yet that cross-genre approach would soon appear everywhere, from Ice-T forming a heavy metal group to more mainstream collisions of rock and rap during the 90s and early 2000s. After the lawsuit dust settled, Jamie's Crying enjoyed a second life, showing up in pop culture moments that introduced Van Halen's early sound to new generations. The track made a cameo in Howard Stern's film Private Parts, a comedic take on the shock jock's life. It also held a prize spot on the soundtrack, reaching yet another circle of listeners who may never have explored Van Halen's debut. Around the same time, the rise of rhythm-based video games brought older rock tracks to the forefront for younger audiences. Guitar Hero Van Halen featured Jamie's Crying as a testament to the band's unmistakable riffs. Gamers discovered the joys and challenges of attempting to replicate Eddie Van Halen's fingerwork on a plastic guitar. Even longtime Van Halen fans revisited the tune, rediscovering how dynamic that simple two-note pattern could be. As for Tone Loc, he never replicated the massive success of his first album, though he did release another record and produce for other artists. He also made a name for himself in acting, popping up in movies and TV. But to many, he remains best known for Wild Thing and Funky Cold Medina, another hit that sampled a laundry list of classic rock tracks. From Foreigner to Funkadelic, Tone Loc and his collaborators were unafraid to borrow from the best, forging a gritty, rock-tinged hip-hop sound that was ahead of its time. That synergy between Van Halen and Tone Loc, while fraught with tension and legal headaches, added a new dimension to both their careers. Van Halen fans were reminded that even a deep cut can become a massive hit, if it's used in the right way. And Tone Loc's listeners got a crash course in the raw power of Eddie Van Halen's guitar, marking a collision of genres that felt fresh in a rapidly evolving music industry. So, did a rapper steal Van Halen's thunder, or did he revive a hidden gem from their catalog? The story of Jamie's Crying and Wild Thing cut straight to the core of how modern music is made. In one sense, Eddie Van Halen's guitar wizardry gave Wild Thing the spark it needed to become a crossover phenomenon, one that introduced rock riffs to hip-hop clubs around the nation. In another sense, the sample license fiasco turned into a windfall for Van Halen, once they found out about it and renegotiated to get proper credit and compensation. At its heart, this saga is a reminder that truly groundbreaking sounds can transcend boundaries, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Van Halen's raw power appealed not just to rock purists, but to ambitious producers with an ear for the next big thing. Tone Locke's gravelly rap flow latched onto an unlikely riff, and together, they lit up the charts in a way few saw coming. Whether you see it as a triumphant fusion or a cautionary tale about music rights, there's no denying the influence Wild Thing had, or the lasting appeal of Jamie's Crying. As for where everyone stands today, Van Halen cemented their place in rock history many times over. From multi-platinum albums to epic tours, Tone Loc remains a staple of old-school hip-hop nostalgia, with Wild Thing and Funky Cold Medina fueling throwback playlists across the globe. Neither party truly lost in the long run, and fans of both genres got to see just how powerful a good riff can be, no matter who's spinning it. What do you think? Should artists be honored when they get sampled, or did Van Halen have every right to be furious? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of rock and hip-hop history. After all, the music world is full of hidden gems just waiting to be exposed.